welcome to my university. I'm pleased to have you here. I'm a political scientist, I'm not a lawyer, and I apologise in advance. I hope I'm not going to be the black fly in your Chardonnay. But I want to talk to you about politics and policy in Australia with regards to animal welfare, drawing on the material that I gathered for my forthcoming book. And I guess what I'd say is my book is not a book of advocacy. I went to both activists and also industry people and said, I want to write a book about how policy is made in Australia. I don't want to argue a particular point of view. And that gave me, I think, for a book on animal welfare and animal rights, a unique insight, because I actually got to talk to a lot of industry people about what's going on and their attitudes. So I want to reflect on that in my address if I can. Let me just start by setting the scene. It's the turn of a new century. We have a vibrant social movement in Australia that is active in promoting a new vision for our relationship between humans and animals. It's starting up a range of organisations that we might describe as welfarist on one hand, rights, or total T abolitionist on the other. They're setting up a range of different organisations. They're advocating and lobbying for legislative change. They're recruiting policy elites onto their cause. They're getting new legislation passed. They are raising money. They're having a big impact on the culture through the use of innovative new media strategies, particularly popular media. And importantly, they're bringing about cultural change. Vegetarian restaurants and societies are springing up all across Australia, not just in the big cities, but also in towns and regional cities. And this is where we're at the start of the 20th century, not the 21st century, right? And in a period of about 10 years from the start of the 20th century, all the vegetarian societies, most of the vegetarian restaurants will have closed down. The vibrant new total T abolitionist movement is being suppressed. It's being replaced by a group of relatively conservative organisations that will be welfare advocates and welfare providers, but are much more conservative in their orientation and their aims. And in a sense, animal-human relations is going to be dominated by largely the RSPCAs and the animal welfare leagues for the next 50 years. And it is not until Peter Singer publishes his book, and people like Christine Townend in New South Wales and Paddy Mark in Victoria read that book and become inspired, that we see a new rising of this movement about animal rights and a new relationship between human and animals. So I guess the first kind of downer that I want to say today is that political scientists also like to say history is not necessarily automatically progressive. We can think about progressive social change that has occurred, but we can also think about progressive social change that has gone backwards. If you're an advocate for the rights of women in the United States to gain access to reproductive rights, that has gone backwards in that country. The Republican movement in this country has gone backwards. So change is not always progressive. So I'd like to give a slightly down in the mouth, I guess, and I hope it's not too down in the mouth, kind of review of where we're at in Australia, the successes, and I guess the limits of those victories in a kind of productive sort of way. Not as an advocate or an activist myself, but as an analyst and a political scientist. So where we are today is we are in the midst of an advocacy explosion in Australia. There are between 200 to 300 animal welfare and activist organisations in this country, about one per every 100,000 people. There's been a dramatic increase in the number of organisations around Australia that are interested in and advocating for and on behalf of animals. And they're doing it in new and creative ways, and Voiceless is a good example of that. Moving into new spaces, doing new sorts of things, refuges and the like, right? They've got a diversity of kind of political perspectives, a diversity of kind of agency, and a diversity in what they're doing. And so I guess what I'm going to say is, what does political science tell us about the behaviour of these organisations, their capacity to achieve change, and what sort of strategies might be effective? So I guess the first concern, and I think following up on this excellent presentation we've just had, is that political scientists are often really concerned with public opinion, right? So public opinion is something we talk about a lot. And public opinion is critical because it's an important enabler for change, right? So when political scientists talk about public opinion, we talk about three things. We talk about the directionality of change. How is public opinion changing? In what direction, right? How are attitudes different now than when they were in the past? We talk about the depth of change. How deeply are attitudes held? And we also talk about the complexity of people's understanding of the particular issues or policy areas that they're dealing with. And so this is particularly important because directionality tells us about where we might be going when we talk about what changes are likely to be considered in the polity we're dealing with. The depth of feeling talks about the extent to which people will invest their time and effort and energy in causes to achieve change. And finally, and critically I think, the depth of understanding is really important because it allows us to understand how well citizens as individuals can hold governments and policymakers to account in their implementation of change. Right? When they go about changing public policy, if we don't understand the nature and dynamics of the policy areas we're dealing with, we cannot effectively hold them to account. We cannot be that monitorial citizen. So what are Australians' attitudes like today with regards to animals? The first thing I'm going to say is Australians love animals. We kill about 500 million animals in Australia, and individually we eat 22 animals per person. We are some of the largest consumers of meat in the world per capita, and it has been an enduring aspect of the Australian psyche since foundation. Meat 3 times a day was the advertisement to free settlers to come to Australia from the UK. The number of animals we eat has gone up over a period of time, particularly as we've shifted from eating cows to eating a lot of chickens. So in terms of the raw carnage, we are massive consumers of animals in this country. The second thing I think it's safe to say is that Australians love animals, right? When you ask Australians about their attitudes to animals, 99% of Australians will say they strongly oppose cruelty to animals. The last 1% are not psychopaths. They're like, I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. There's always someone in the room who's a little bit out to sea, sort of thing. So Australians have an extremely disparate and slightly strange relationship with animals. We love them, and yet we eat a lot of them. And this disparity is explained in this basic way. Australians really love the animals we are proximate to. So about 90% of Australians who have pets, right, companion animals, will say that that animal is either a member of their family or a close companion to them. 90%, right? When the budget of the household is under pressure, people will forgo other things before they degrade the food that they give to their animal, right? And we've seen a massive growth in premium pet foods in Australia. We really love animals that are proximate to us. Animals that are not proximate to us, animals in the wild, animals in food production systems, animals in entertainment, animals in the lab, we don't care that much about, particularly when they're in aggregate and collectives. And importantly, in a sense, because we have become one of the most urbanised countries in the world, Australians have an extremely low level of understanding about how animals are treated in food production systems. Now, over the last few decades, however, the work of activists, both domestically and internationally, has led to an expanding circle of compassion that Australians have for animals. We care about more animals than ever before, particularly and interestingly, animals that used to be what we would call unpopular species. And for those of you who've been involved in, who have been following the anti-shark cull movement, has seen an incredible and quite astounding movement around an extremely unpopular species, right? Where people have gone out in large numbers. Also, we've also seen, I guess, a depth in people's willingness to commit to the issue of animals. So those people who care about animals are much more willing to donate money, to donate their time, to mobilise around animal welfare. But this kind of comparative expansion in our concern, our depth of kind of commitment is tempted by the kind of egocentrism that was talked about in the last lecture. And so what we see is that when we actually ask people about their kind of political concern, are they concerned with the kind of political standing of animals, what Australians tend to say is their level of policy concern is highest for those animals that are furthest away from their proximate interests. So we are least satisfied with animal laws that are related to animals that we don't eat, that we don't like to enjoy, either as animals in the wild or animals in entertainment. So there is an ongoing disconnect that flows through from our alienation from animals that feeds into the political system. And if we look at the last two categories, where Australians think animal laws in Australia are the least sufficient, we can see that one of them is problematic, animals in laboratories, right? Which does tend to have a number of extremely significant ethical issues, but also an incredibly extensive regulatory regime around it. And secondly, animals exported for food, right? The issue of live exports. So I want to turn to the issue of live exports because I think it illustrates something important about our understanding about the politics of animals, animal welfare and animal rights in Australia. And that is illustrated in this graph, which is, in a sense, a content analysis of popular media, usually newspapers, reporting about animal welfare and animal issues in Australia. And what I'm going to tell you is that, by and large, on an average day, the Australian media does not spend a lot of time talking about the issues that concern you in coming to this room, right? But we can see there, 2011, right? The Four Corners, a bloody business special on Indonesian live exports, led to a massive mobilisation. And for the animal activists who were part of that, Animals Australia and the RSPCA, this completely caught them off guard. Their websites crashed, they were completely unprepared to deal with the massive mobilisation of Australians' concerns about animals for export. Additionally, political elites, politicians, report that no issue in recent memory, the carbon tax, asylum seekers, anything that is a headline issue on a day-to-day basis, has created the number of calls, letters, or emails to their office in the last decade as live export issue. And we can see what an enduring and indelible impact it had on media discussion about animal welfare in this country. But I think we have to also recognise that this is encouraging to animal protection organisations, but that it can be overstated. And the spike and then the drop-off tells us something very powerful. This looks like Anthony Downs' notion of the issue attention cycle. Those issues that get a strong, very visceral and emotional response from the community, but are not sustained in the public awareness over time. And the problem, of course, with this is, while we saw in 2011 significant policy changes around the welfare of animals for export in Australia through the introduction of the SCAS export regulatory regime, a very interesting piece of law, not completely novel, but the extraterritorial application of Australian welfare laws to animals that had left Australia, so quite unique and expansive in its scope and innovation. The Australian Labor Party came this close to moving at its national conference a policy to ban animal exports completely, as New Zealand had done at one stage for sheep, and introduced at that time the policy to introduce the Independent Office for Animal Welfare into its initiative. While those policy achievements were the result of this massive spike in popular attention, the failure to sustain this over the long term has meant that those policies have not been sustained. So the SCAS system for exports has incrementally, piece by piece, been dismantled since that point in time. The Australian Labor Party did not adopt a ban on exports and is now very likely to drop its commitment to an independent office for animal welfare. Certainly, if you talk to people within the Labor Party, they will tell you, blank to your face, there is no way we will ever do this, regardless of whether it stays in our policy platform or whatever. So we have to recognise that this policy area is one that can mobilise Australians, but doesn't necessarily hold their attention, and that can be problematic. Now, I think the argument about the kind of success of animal protection and activist movement in Australia in recent years is sometimes predicated on examples like the live export spike, which I would argue is exceptional rather than the norm in Australia, and also another argument that follows the basic logic: first they ignore you, then they fight you, then you win. Certainly, the animal protection community has been very interested in the way in which animal agricultural industry has fought back, using things like ag-gag laws against animal activist organisations. And I enjoyed a Voiceless lecture a few years ago by Will Potter, the author of Green is the New Red, who talked about ag-gag in the United States. And here we have the example of ag-gag in Australia, and the leading example of ag-gag is here in New South Wales, the Biosecurity Act that was passed by this current government. And you can see the exact language that Will Potter talked about in his lecture. These people, you people, are akin, like, terrorists, right? But while this can be seen as the suppression of the animal activist movement, it can also be overread. Certainly, animal agriculture as an industry has a very tight relationship with a key group of policymakers, usually ministers for agriculture and the departments of agriculture, what we call an iron triangle. Strong interconnection, strong shared commitment to a singular identity, and ability to resist activist intrusion into their policy-making space. But we also have to recognise that one of the reasons why this industry is bringing in legislation like this is because of their weakness. Agriculture in Australia is no longer a special or protected industry in this country. Following the 1970s, with the deregulation of agriculture, the agricultural industry is being treated increasingly like any other industry. And this has given activist organisations the chance to utilise legal methods like the Australian Consumer and Competition Commission to sue producers in the way in which they sue any other industry. So they are no longer protected. The strength of the industry lies largely in Australians' attitudes towards farmers, in which Australians largely see farmers as well-meaning, hard-working, honest people who need to be protected because of their inherent goodness. So, what is likely to be successful political strategies in Australia? The first is, clearly, changing public attitudes is one of the most significant and important ways in which animal activists have been effective in producing policy change. But as this figure, I think, demonstrates, we also have to be very cautious in seeing animal concerns as moving into the acceptable centre of Australian political life. So when we survey Australians and ask them what is acceptable for animal activists, organisations to engage in, the public is most acceptable of the sorts of least confronting, least intrusive political strategies. Legislative strategies, lobbying, petitioning, and the media. And they object strategies like the use of boycotts, like demonstrations. Now, on one level, this reflects Australians' natural political conservatism that we've seen over many years. But what it also means is that animal activists need to build greater acceptance in the community for its wider range of political strategies. Political strategies that are likely to be useful in the Australian context are probably not going to be those of institutional integration because of the way in which particularly the National Party in Australia manages to dominate departments of agriculture. It is likely to be largely through changing and converting public attitudes to support the overall objectives of the movement, as well as increasingly developing networks with other social movements. And we've seen considerable successes in beating back ag-gag and anti-protest type legislation where social movements have come together. In addition, drawing the concerns of animal rights activists into other rights discourses is going to be extremely important. And one of the areas we've seen the production system come under considerable pressure to improve its internal practices has been through labour standards and labour rights organisations. Animal rights organisations often have extremely similar concerns to the union movement and labour activists. And one of my colleagues, Dinesh Waterwal, is working to look at ways in which these social movements might be coming together. But there are tensions, and there are also increasing threats to the capacity of animal activists to have a broad effect. The first is there is an incredibly underutilised capacity within the Australian rural community to mobilise its cultural capital, the rural aesthetic, the agricultural nostalgia, as Linda Bottrell calls it, to extreme effect. And Elements within animal agriculture are working as we speak to utilise the same sort of social media strategies to mobilise farming communities in opposition to the messaging that we've seen animal rights organisations be very effective at dominating. Finally, I guess what I'd like to say, because I've run out of time, is just this question about the electoral possibility of this issue in Australia. And what I'm going to say is this. In Australia, animal welfare is an issue that does mobilise some people. But it is what we would call, as political scientists, a second-order issue, right? It is not the issue that moves people's primary vote in this country. So what I'm going to say is that Australia's political structure as a majoritarian system, under the Westminster model that discourages coalitions of autonomous small political parties to form government, and actively is hostile to small political parties, as we've seen with the Senate reforms, is not the ideal environment for an electoral strategy. The success of the Animal Justice Party in achieving about 1.6 to 1.8% of the primary vote is shy of the 4% of people who said animal welfare is a primary concern for them electorally. So we can see that they have a bit of a range to go. But they won that seat in the jurisdiction and the place most likely for them to win, the Upper House of New South Wales, which is the single largest electorate in Australia with the smallest margin to win a seat. Unless the Animal Justice Party can really build a base of support that gets towards 6 to 10%, it will not break through in other jurisdictions into seats. That does not say the electoral strategy is a bad strategy. It gives the movement legitimacy. It gives them a place to scrutinise government legislatively. It gives them resources. But it is not necessarily, in the Australian context, going to achieve significant change. Thank you.